The courtroom at 100 Center Street went dead silent on March 14th, 1952. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect. This was the silence of disbelief, the kind that happens when everyone realizes they've been watching the wrong show. Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy Johnson, sat perfectly still at the defense table, his expression unreadable behind those thick-framed glasses he always wore. At 45 years old, his reputation preceded him into every room in Manhattan. The police called him a monster. Harlem called him something else entirely. 6 white officers sat in the gallery, their uniforms pressed sharp, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They'd testified that morning with the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. Detective Frank Russo had pointed directly at Bumpy, his voice steady as he described finding 2 kilos of heroin in a car Johnson allegedly owned. His partner, Officer Thomas McMahon, nodded along, corroborating every detail with mechanical precision. The prosecution had rested. The case seemed airtight, another Harlem kingpin going down for narcotics possession. The DA's office had been building cases like this for months, part of a larger campaign they called cleaning up the streets. Between January and March of 1952 alone, they'd arrested 47 black men on drug charges in a 10-block radius. 47 arrests, 3 convictions. But the arrests kept coming. What happened next would expose a pattern of corruption so systematic that it reached all the way to the mayor's office. But first, the defense attorney had to do something that seemed impossible in 1952 New York. Make a white jury believe 6 police officers were lying. Bumpy's lawyer stood up. His name was Raymond Lofton, one of the few black attorneys practicing criminal defense in Manhattan at the time. He'd been working this case for 6 weeks, sleeping 4 hours a night, building something nobody expected. "Your Honor," Lofton said quietly, "I'd like to call a witness." The name he spoke made Officer Russo's face drain of color. But to understand why that name mattered, why it made hardened cops suddenly look like they'd seen a ghost, you have to go back 13 years earlier to a Harlem that was both more dangerous and more alive than most people could imagine. Harlem in 1939 was a contradiction wrapped in a paradox and set to a jazz beat. On Lenox Avenue, you could hear Duke Ellington playing at the Cotton Club, while 3 blocks away, families lined up at soup kitchens that had been running continuously since the Depression supposedly ended. The neighborhood held roughly 200,000 people in less than 2 square miles, one of the densest populations in America. The unemployment rate for black men sat at 42%. For white men citywide, it was 18%. Into this pressure cooker walked Bumpy Johnson, fresh out of a 10-year stretch in Sing Sing for armed robbery. He was 32 years old and had exactly $73 to his name. Within 5 years, he'd be running the numbers racket across 8 separate territories, employing over 300 people, and sitting down with politicians who wouldn't dare be photographed with him. But he didn't do it alone. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen to everyone who mattered, had been running the numbers in Harlem since 1923. She was a black woman from Martinique who'd built an empire in a world designed to crush people like her twice over. She wore custom suits, spoke 5 languages, and had a reputation for 2 things: mathematical genius and absolute intolerance for betrayal. When Bumpy got out of prison, St. Clair was in a war she was losing. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, a white mobster from the Bronx, had been moving into Harlem for 2 years, using tactics that made Al Capone look subtle. He didn't just want the numbers game. He wanted to erase every black operator and replace them with his own people. Between 1937 and 1939, 42 people connected to the Harlem numbers died violently. Not all of them were shot. Some just disappeared. Schultz had the police in his pocket. Not all of them, but enough. He paid the 28th Precinct's Captain William Dodge approximately $1,200 a week, worth about $26,000 in today's money. In return, Dodge made sure that every time one of St. Clair's runners got arrested, it happened right before a big numbers draw, when they'd be carrying the most cash. Stephanie St. Clair needed muscle. She needed someone who understood the streets, but could think 3 moves ahead. She needed someone the neighborhood would actually respect. She chose Bumpy. Their first meeting happened at a social club on 140th Street. Witnesses said it lasted 4 hours. When they emerged, St. Clair had a new enforcer. Bumpy had a purpose, and Dutch Schultz had a problem he didn't know existed yet. What made Bumpy different from other enforcers wasn't his capacity for violence, though he had that in abundance. It was his understanding of power dynamics that went beyond brute force. He'd spent 10 years in Sing Sing reading everything he could get his hands on: philosophy, military history, chess theory. He came out understanding something most street criminals never grasped. Fear isn't about how many people you hurt. It's about how many you could hurt, but choose not to. Within 3 months of joining forces with St. Clair, Bumpy had neutralized 2 of Schultz's main collectors without firing a single shot. He convinced them to work for St. Clair instead, using a combination of money and information about their boss that made staying loyal seem suicidal. When Schultz sent enforcers to retaliate, Bumpy was always 3 blocks away, with witnesses who'd swear he was playing checkers in a barber shop. The police couldn't touch him because he wasn't breaking laws they could prove. Schultz couldn't kill him because Bumpy had made himself too visible, too connected to the community. Harlem had adopted him as their own, and white mobsters who killed local heroes tended to find themselves with bigger problems than lost revenue. But then, on October 23, 1935, everything changed. Dutch Schultz was shot in the bathroom of the Palace Chop House in Newark. He died the next day, muttering incoherent phrases about French-Canadian bean soup and a boy with his boots on. The hit was ordered by Lucky Luciano and the newly formed commission, the Mafia's governing body, because Schultz had become too reckless, too visible, too dangerous to the organization's long-term interests. With Schultz dead, the Harlem numbers racket fell into chaos. 5 different crews tried to claim his territory. The NYPD, suddenly without their primary source of protection money in the neighborhood, started making real arrests for the first time in years. And Bumpy Johnson saw an opportunity. He didn't grab territory. He didn't declare himself king. Instead, he did something smarter. He organized. Most people remember Bumpy Johnson as a gangster. The people who knew him in the 1940s remember him as something stranger, a negotiator. After Dutch Schultz's death, Bumpy spent 6 months setting up a meeting that would redefine Harlem's underworld. On April 3, 1936, representatives from 7 different numbers operations sat down in the back room of a funeral home on St. Nicholas Avenue. Stephanie St. Clair was there. So were the Bronzeville crew, the Strivers Row operators, and even 2 representatives from Lucky Luciano's organization who'd been sent to see if Harlem could be managed without another war. The meeting lasted 9 hours. What emerged was unprecedented. A cooperative agreement where each operator kept their territory, but paid into a central fund that would cover legal fees, police bribes, and mutual protection. Bumpy would serve as the mediator, not the boss, but the person who kept everyone honest. It shouldn't have worked. These were criminals with long memories and short fuses. But Bumpy had done his homework. He'd spent those 6 months learning everyone's weak points, their family situations, their ambitions. He came to that meeting knowing exactly what each person needed to hear to say yes. To St. Clair, he offered respect and autonomy. To the younger operators, he offered protection from both the police and the Italian mobs. To Luciano's representatives, he offered something more valuable: stability and predictable revenue without the risk of headlines. For 7 years, it worked. Harlem's numbers became one of the most efficiently run illegal operations in American history. The NYPD estimated that by 1943, the combined operations were generating approximately $50 million annually, about $870 million in today's money. The police were bribed, but systematically and carefully. Politicians received campaign contributions that were never quite large enough to draw federal attention. and the neighborhood itself benefited in ways that statistics couldn't capture. Bumpy Johnson became a folk hero without trying to be one. He paid rent for families facing eviction. He funded funerals for people who died with nothing. When the 28th Precinct tried to shut down a popular jazz club in 1941, claiming it was a public nuisance, Bumpy showed up at the precinct captain's office with a file folder containing photographs of said captain leaving a brothel on 3 separate occasions. The club stayed open. But here's what most documentaries get wrong. Bumpy wasn't Robin Hood. He wasn't stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. He was running a protection racket, a gambling operation, and later, when the opportunity arose, he was moving narcotics. The complexity is important, because when the cops finally came for him in 1952, they weren't wrong about what he was. They were wrong about how they could catch him, and they were willing to lie to do it. The officer who started the whole thing was Detective Frank Russo, badge number 4782. He joined the NYPD in 1948, assigned to the narcotics division in Harlem. Russo was 31 years old, married with 2 kids, and by all accounts, he was a true believer. He genuinely thought he was fighting a righteous war against the people destroying his city with drugs. He was also a racist who couldn't tell the difference between a drug dealer and a successful black businessman, which in 1950s Harlem was a dangerous combination. Russo had been building a file on Bumpy for 18 months before the arrest. The problem was Bumpy was too smart to handle drugs directly. He had layers of insulation, runners, lieutenants, people who would never flip because Bumpy's reputation for both generosity and vengeance was ironclad. So Russo did what frustrated cops have done throughout history when they can't catch someone legitimately. He decided to manufacture evidence. February 12, 1952, a Tuesday. Bumpy Johnson was having dinner at Wells Supper Club on 7th Avenue when Detective Russo and 5 officers burst through the door. They claimed they'd received a tip about a car parked outside. A 1949 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, cream-colored, registered to an E.R. Johnson. Russo said they found 2 kilos of heroin in the trunk. Bumpy was arrested on the spot. The newspapers ran the story the next morning with headlines like Harlem drug lord caught and narcotics kingpin arrested in heroin bust. The New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, ran a different headline. Police claim evidence against Johnson. Community skeptical. Because here's the thing. That car wasn't Bumpy's. It was registered to an E.R. Johnson. Sure, Ernest Raymond Johnson, a postal worker from Brooklyn who'd never even been to that supper club. The registration had been filed 6 months earlier. The car had been reported stolen 3 days before the arrest. But Russo's report stated clearly that Bumpy had been seen exiting the vehicle just minutes before the police arrived. Officer Thomas McMahon corroborated this. So did Officer Patrick O'Malley, Officer Vincent Delacroix, and 2 other officers whose names would later become very important. The trial was set for March. Bumpy's lawyer, Raymond Lofton, had 8 weeks to dismantle a case built on the testimony of 6 police officers who all told the exact same story. Lofton started by finding Ernest Raymond Johnson, the real owner of the Cadillac. Johnson was a 41-year-old black man with no criminal record who'd reported his car stolen on February 9th, 3 days before the arrest. He had the police report to prove it. He'd filed it at the 67th Precinct in Brooklyn. But when Lofton tried to submit this as evidence, the prosecution argued it was irrelevant. The car, they said, had been in Bumpy's possession when arrested, regardless of who it was registered to. The judge agreed. Lofton tried another angle. Where was the chain of custody for the heroin? Who logged it? Who witnessed the search? All 6 officers confirmed they'd seen Detective Russo open the trunk and discover the drugs. The evidence had been logged properly. The chain of custody was clean. On paper, it was perfect. Too perfect. Lofton spent 3 weeks interviewing witnesses from the supper club. 12 people were there the night of the arrest. All 12 said the same thing. Bumpy Johnson had arrived at 7:15 p.m. on foot. He'd walked from his apartment 6 blocks away. He hadn't driven anything. But witness testimony from black patrons of a Harlem jazz club versus 6 white police officers. In 1952 New York, not exactly a fair fight. The prosecution felt so confident they rested their case after just 4 days. The jury looked convinced. Even Bumpy seemed resigned to the outcome, sitting quietly at the defense table, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Then came March 14th, the day Raymond Lofton called his surprise witness. If you're watching this because you care about real history, the kind they don't teach in schools because it's too messy, too complicated, too human, then hit that subscribe button. These stories take weeks of research to verify, and your support means we can keep digging into the cases that deserve to be remembered. Your Honor, I'd like to call Officer Harold Watkins to the stand. The name hung in the air like smoke. Detective Russo turned to look at his fellow officers. Officer McMahon's hand went to his collar. In the gallery, 2 of the other cops who testified actually stood up as if they were about to leave. The judge, a 62-year-old man named Irving Greenberg, looked at his paperwork. Officer Watkins wasn't on the witness list. No, Your Honor, Lofton said. He wasn't, because the prosecution never mentioned him. I don't understand the relevance, Counselor. You will, Your Honor. Officer Watkins was present at the arrest on February 12th. He was the 7th officer on the scene, and he has some interesting observations about what actually happened that night. The prosecution objected immediately. There were shouting matches between the attorneys. Judge Greenberg called a recess to review the request. During that recess, something remarkable happened in the hallway outside the courtroom. Detective Frank Russo confronted Raymond Lofton directly, with multiple witnesses present. According to testimony that would later come out during the departmental investigation, Russo grabbed Lofton by the arm and said, "You don't know what you're doing. Watkins is a lying degenerate. Whatever he told you is bullshit." Lofton calmly responded, "Then you have nothing to worry about." Russo's exact reply can't be printed in most newspapers, but 3 court reporters heard it, and it was recorded in the official investigation transcript. Judge Greenberg allowed the testimony. Officer Harold Watkins took the stand at 2:47 p.m. on March 14, 1952. He was 34 years old, had been with the NYPD for 9 years, and had a spotless record. He'd received 2 commendations for bravery. He was married to a schoolteacher. He'd grown up in Queens, the son of Irish immigrants. And he looked terrified. Lofton began gently. "Officer Watkins, were you present at the arrest of Ellsworth Johnson on February 12th of this year?" "I was." "Can you describe what you witnessed?" Watkins took a breath. His hands were shaking. "We received a call around 8:30 p.m. Detective Russo said there was a credible tip about a narcotics vehicle parked outside Wells Supper Club. 7 of us responded. 7 officers for a parked car? That's what I thought was strange, yes." The prosecution objected. Judge Greenberg overruled it. Lofton continued. "What happened when you arrived?" Detective Russo went straight to the Cadillac. He had keys. The courtroom stirred. This was new information. He had keys to the vehicle? "Yes, sir." He opened the trunk without breaking the lock. The keys worked perfectly. Did he explain how he had keys to a car that had been reported stolen 3 days earlier? "No, sir." Nobody asked. What happened next? Watkins looked directly at Russo as he spoke. He pulled out a paper bag from the trunk. Inside were 2 bricks of what he said was heroin. Then he went into the supper club and arrested Mr. Johnson, who was eating dinner. Did Mr. Johnson have keys to this vehicle on his person? "No, sir. He had apartment keys, nothing else." Did anyone ask Mr. Johnson if the car was his? Detective Russo did. Mr. Johnson said he'd never seen it before. Russo said he was lying, that witnesses had seen him drive up in it. What witnesses? He didn't say. Lofton paused, letting that sink in. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Officer Watkins, why weren't you included on the witness list for this trial?" Watkins looked at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Because I told Detective Russo I wouldn't testify to something I didn't see. And what didn't you see? I never saw Mr. Johnson near that car. Not once. He came out of the supper club in handcuffs, asking what was happening. The first time I saw him look at that Cadillac was when Russo was pointing at it, telling him he was under arrest. The courtroom exploded. Judge Greenberg had to bang his gavel 6 times to restore order. The prosecution was on its feet, calling Watkins a liar, demanding this testimony be stricken. The jury was watching it all with wide eyes. But Lofton wasn't done. "Officer Watkins, do you know why Detective Russo had keys to that vehicle?" "Objection." The prosecutor was nearly screaming. "Speculation." "I'll rephrase," Lofton said calmly. "Officer Watkins, did you personally witness anything that would explain how Detective Russo came to possess keys to a vehicle reported stolen 3 days prior to the arrest?" Watkins nodded slowly. "2 days before the arrest, I saw Detective Russo meeting with a man named Calvin Pierce in a diner on Amsterdam Avenue. Pierce is a known car thief. I recognized him from previous arrests. Did you report this meeting?" "I mentioned it to Russo. He said Pierce was an informant, that he was developing him as a source." "Did you believe him?" The prosecution objected again. Judge Greenberg sustained it this time. But the damage was done. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Detective Russo had arranged for a car to be stolen, planted drugs in it, and then discovered those drugs in order to arrest Bumpy Johnson. Lofton had one more question. "Officer Watkins, why are you testifying today? You've put your career at risk, possibly your safety. Why come forward?" Watkins looked directly at the jury. "Because I took an oath, and because I've been watching us do this to other people for 2 years. I can't do it anymore. Whatever happens to me, I can't watch another innocent man go to prison on manufactured evidence." The prosecution tried to destroy Harold Watkins on cross-examination. They brought up a disciplinary report from 1949 when Watkins had been late to work 3 times in 1 week. They questioned his memory, his motivations, his relationship with the defense. They suggested he'd been paid off, that he had a grudge against Russo, that he was lying to get attention. But Watkins didn't break. Every answer was calm, measured, consistent. And the more the prosecution attacked him, the more credible he seemed. Then Raymond Lofton dropped his second bomb. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce evidence that corroborates Officer Watkins' testimony." He presented 3 pieces of evidence that the prosecution hadn't known existed. First, a receipt from a diner on Amsterdam Avenue, dated February 10th, 1952, showing that 2 coffees and 2 sandwiches were purchased at 3:47 p.m. The receipt had been signed by the owner, who identified the customers as Detective Russo and a man matching Calvin Pierce's description. The diner owner was present in court, willing to testify. Second, phone records showing that Detective Russo had called a number registered to Calvin Pierce's known associate 4 times in the week before the arrest. Third, a statement from Ernest Raymond Johnson, the actual owner of the stolen Cadillac, who identified Calvin Pierce from a photograph as the man who'd approached him 2 weeks before the theft, asking detailed questions about the car's security system. The prosecution asked for a recess. Judge Greenberg denied it. Over the next 2 hours, the entire case against Bumpy Johnson collapsed like a building with a rotten foundation. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. Not guilty. But here's what makes this case extraordinary. The verdict was just the beginning. Within a week of the trial's conclusion, the New York Police Department opened an internal investigation into Detective Frank Russo and the 5 officers who'd corroborated his testimony. The investigation, led by Deputy Inspector William Brennan, uncovered a pattern of misconduct that was breathtaking in its scope. Between January 1950 and March 1952, Russo and his team had arrested 63 people in Harlem on drug-related charges. Of those 63 arrests, 41 followed the same pattern: a tip about a vehicle, a search that produced drugs, testimony from multiple officers who all told identical stories. 41 arrests. But when investigators looked closer, they found problems with nearly all of them. In 18 cases, the vehicles had been reported stolen days before the arrests. In 22 cases, the defendants claimed they'd never been near the cars in question. In 37 cases, Detective Russo had somehow obtained keys to the vehicles without explaining how. The investigation revealed that Russo had been working with a network of car thieves and small-time criminals who would steal vehicles, park them near known criminals or activists, and tip off Russo. Russo would then plant drugs, often seized in other arrests and never logged as evidence, and make the arrest. It was systematic. It was organized, and it had been happening for years. But here's the part that never made it into the history books. Russo wasn't doing this for money. During the internal investigation, Russo gave a statement that was later sealed but leaked to reporters in 1967. In it, he explained his reasoning with chilling clarity. "These people are destroying the city," he said. "They run drugs, prostitution, gambling. They corrupt our youth. And the system can't touch them because they're smart, they have lawyers, they have money. So yes, I made sure the evidence was there. I made sure they couldn't walk away. I did what needed to be done to protect this city." In Russo's mind, he was a hero. The law was failing, so he'd taken matters into his own hands. The fact that he was framing innocent people, or at least people who were guilty of different crimes than the ones he arrested them for, didn't register as a moral problem. To him, it was a tactical solution. 3 of the officers who testified against Bumpy were fired. 2 resigned before they could be terminated. Detective Frank Russo was convicted of perjury, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. He served 6 years in Sing Sing, the same prison where Bumpy Johnson had done his time decades earlier. Officer Harold Watkins was transferred to a different precinct. He received death threats for 3 months. Someone threw a brick through his window. His wife was harassed at the school where she taught. But he continued serving as a police officer until his retirement in 1971. He died in 1989. His obituary in the New York Times was 3 paragraphs long and didn't mention the trial. As for Bumpy Johnson, the acquittal didn't slow him down. He walked out of that courtroom on March 14th, 1952, and returned to running Harlem exactly as he had before. The trial, if anything, had enhanced his legend. He was now the man who'd beaten the NYPD at their own game, who'd exposed corruption at the highest levels, who'd proven that the system could be challenged. But the story doesn't end with triumph. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7th, 1968, in the arms of his friend Frank Lucas, collapsing from a heart attack at Wells Supper Club, the same place he'd been arrested 16 years earlier. He was 62 years old. Over 3,000 people attended his funeral. The New York Times ran an obituary that called him a colorful Harlem figure. The Amsterdam News called him a complicated man in an impossible time. Both were right. The trial in 1952 didn't make Bumpy Johnson a saint. He continued running criminal enterprises until his death. He was involved in narcotics distribution, illegal gambling, and violence. He hurt people. He corrupted systems. He was, by any objective measure, a criminal. But the trial exposed something more important than one man's guilt or innocence. It revealed the mechanics of institutional racism in American law enforcement. The NYPD's internal investigation eventually expanded beyond Russo's team. By 1955, they'd identified patterns of evidence fabrication in 11 different precincts across New York City, concentrated primarily in Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. The investigation resulted in 43 terminations, over 100 disciplinary actions, and reforms to evidence handling that remained in place for decades. But here's what didn't change: the underlying belief system that had motivated Russo in the first place. In 2013, a federal judge ruled that the NYPD's stop-and-frisk policies were unconstitutional, noting that they disproportionately targeted Black and Latino men. In 2020, during protests following George Floyd's murder, The Civilian Complaint Review Board released data showing that NYPD officers were substantially more likely to use force against black suspects than white suspects in identical situations. The names change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental dynamic that Bumpy Johnson faced in 1952, a criminal justice system that treats black criminality as an existential threat requiring extra-legal solutions, persists. What makes the 1952 trial historically significant isn't that it was unique. It's that it was documented. Most of the people Frank Russo framed didn't have Raymond Lofton as their lawyer. They didn't have the resources to investigate their own cases. They didn't have a Harold Watkins willing to risk everything to tell the truth. They took plea deals or they went to prison, and their stories disappeared into the machinery of the justice system. Bumpy Johnson's story survived because he had power. He had connections. He had money to pay for a defense. The injustice he faced was identical to the injustice faced by hundreds of other Harlem residents. But he was one of the few with the resources to fight back. That's both the power and the tragedy of his story. In 1967, a young lawyer named William Kunstler used transcript from the Bumpy Johnson trial in a brief challenging evidence in a Black Panther case. He argued that the pattern of police misconduct exposed in 1952 demonstrated a systemic problem that courts needed to take seriously. The judge rejected the argument, but the brief became a template for future civil rights attorneys. In 1985, a documentary filmmaker interviewed Raymond Lofton, then 78 years old and retired. Lofton said the Bumpy Johnson case was both the proudest and saddest moment of his career. Proud because he'd won. Sad because winning one case didn't change the system that had created the injustice in the first place. "We proved they lied," Lofton said. "We proved the system was corrupt. And then the system just kept going. Different cops, same lies. That's what people don't understand. Exposing corruption doesn't end it. It just makes it more careful." Harold Watkins never spoke publicly about the trial after his retirement. But in a private letter to his daughter, written in 1982 and later donated to the New York Historical Society, he reflected on his decision to testify. "I knew what it would cost me," he wrote. "I knew I'd lose friends, that I'd be seen as a traitor. But I also knew that if I stayed silent, I'd lose something worse, the ability to look at myself in the mirror. Your mother used to say that the only way to live with yourself is to be able to defend every choice you've made to the person you want to become. I testified because I wanted to become someone who told the truth, even when it was hard." The courtroom at 100 Center Street still stands. It's been renovated several times, but the basic structure remains the same. If you visit today, there's nothing to mark what happened there in March of 1952. No plaque, no memorial. Just another room where the machinery of justice grinds forward. But for a brief moment in that room, something unusual happened. The machinery broke down. The lies were exposed. The truth came out. Not because the system worked the way it was supposed to, but because a few individuals decided that truth mattered more than convenience, more than career advancement, more than solidarity with their fellow officers. Bumpy Johnson walked free that day not because he was innocent. He wasn't, but because the evidence against him was manufactured. The distinction matters. Justice isn't about letting guilty people go. It's about ensuring the system doesn't become the very thing it claims to fight. The cops who framed Bumpy Johnson believed they were serving justice by any means necessary. They believed the ends justified the means. They believed that technical guilt or innocence mattered less than removing dangerous people from the streets. They were wrong, not because Bumpy was innocent, but because a system that tolerates lies in pursuit of convenience will eventually use those lies against everyone. Today it's a Harlem gangster. Tomorrow it's a union organizer. Next week it's someone who looked at a cop wrong. The slope isn't slippery, it's a cliff. The silence that fell over that courtroom in 1952 wasn't just shock. It was recognition. Everyone in that room understood, in that moment that they've been watching a system expose itself. The lies had become so routine, so systematic, that when someone finally told the truth, it sounded like madness. That's the real lesson of Bumpy Johnson's trial. Not that one man beat the system, but that the system had become so corrupt that beating it required an act of courage from someone inside it. Harold Watkins didn't testify because he liked Bumpy Johnson. He didn't testify because he thought gangsters deserved protection. He testified because he understood something that Detective Russo never could, that the moment you decide truth is optional, you've already lost the war you think you're fighting. Bumpy Johnson died 16 years after that trial, still running the same streets, still connected to the same criminal enterprises. The trial didn't redeem him. It didn't make him a good person. It didn't erase his crimes. But it did prove that even in a system designed to crush certain people, truth still matters. Evidence still matters. Integrity still matters. Not because these things guarantee justice, but because without them, justice becomes impossible. The courtroom fell silent that day in March of 1952 because everyone realized they'd been watching a performance. The performance of law and order. The performance of evidence and testimony. The performance of blind justice. And then, for just a moment, someone pulled back the curtain. What they saw wasn't pretty, but it was real. And sometimes, real is all we've got.